Hello, everyone. I think we're live, which is great. Well, good afternoon. I'm Louisa Graham and I'm Chief Executive of Walkley Foundation. So thank you very much for joining us. Look, I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, or certainly where I am at the moment, which is the elders past and present of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. So I'm so pleased that you can all join us in these challenging times for today's webinar. Who gets to tell Australian stories? And it's examining a report that looks at diversity in television and news and current affairs. Now, this groundbreaking report has been produced by Media Diversity Australia with contributions from a number of people, and I think it's worth reading them out. The Macquarie University, Deakin University, the University of Sydney and Western Sydney University. And funding for this particular project was provided by Google News Labs, MIA, with the in-kind support given by Telemedia and Incentia. And I'd also like to acknowledge Antoinette Latu and Isabel Lowe, who are founding Media Diversity, and for their excellent leadership in getting this momentous report out. As a member of the Media Diversity Australia Board and in my role at the Walkley Foundation, I'm thrilled that we've been able to host this discussion today. And the Walkley Foundation also partners with Media Diversity Australia, which we think is very important, on an award which we announced in June this year and in June the year before. And the award honours journalists who are making an outstanding contribution through their reporting on coverage of diverse peoples in Australia. And this includes culturally linguistic diverse communities and people with disabilities. And this year's winner, Mahmoud Fazel and Rebecca Metcalf, were recognised for their Audible Originals podcast, No Gangsters in Paradise, which provides an honest and raw look into an often marginalised Australia community. And if you haven't heard it or listened to it, I encourage you to access that. It's also available on our website. We definitely need more of this sort of journalism. And whilst the Walkleys are self-nominated, we have seen more diversity being recognised over the last year. We have just closed in these awards, but nominations for outstanding contribution are still open and close on September the 11th. And this is our only self-nominated. This is our only award that's not self-nominated. So it's really up to you to nominate somebody you think who has made an outstanding and enduring commitment to the highest standard of journalism. So if you can think of somebody, or if you want to nominate somebody, please do let us know. You can do so through just contacting us at walkleys@walkleys.com. But before we move on to our panel, take you through some housekeeping. So this will be a 40-minute panel discussion, and it will be followed by 20 minutes of Q&A, and we hope to wrap up at 1:30 so you can all get back to work or get on with the rest of your day. So please, the Q&A on the bottom of the screen, feel free to type your questions there during the session, and the panel will answer them when we get to the end. But you can also vote on questions. So if you vote on questions, they probably have more of a likely chance of being the questions that will be asked, but I'm leaving that up to Nasim. She's our moderator. I'd also like to thank those who made a donation when they registered for this event, and your donations certainly go a long way to supporting the work that we do. So now on with the show, and I'd like to start by introducing your moderator, Nassim Kardem. Nassim is an award-winning journalist reporting on business news across online, radio and TV for the ABC. And she began working as a full-time journalist with The Age in 2003, including as the newspaper's economic correspondent. And before joining the ABC, she worked in various business reporting editing roles for Fairfax Media's BRW magazine, the Australian Financial Review, and as deputy editor for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. Oh, and I forgot to mention that this session is being recorded. So over to you, Nasim.
Thanks for that introduction, Louise. I'm going to introduce our fabulous panellists now. We've got Russell Anderson. So Russell's the CEO at the National Ethnic and Multicultural Broadcasters Council. He's got 30 years experience in journalism, media production and management. He's worked for the UN, for international and national NGOs on media projects, and he was a senior media advisor for East Timor's national broadcaster. Then we've got Tanya Denning-Orman. She has led NITV since it joined SBS in 2012 and more recently became SBS's first director of Indigenous content. She also plays a big role in the development and delivery of First Nations storytelling across the SBS network. With more than 20 years experience working in media, she's previously held positions as a journalist and producer for ABC and SBS and a number of different roles at NITV. And then finally, we've got Andrea Ho. Andrea's a media professional and she's experienced leader and broadcaster, content maker. She's a founding co-director at the Economic Media Centre, which works to strengthen diversity of voices and views around economic and social issues. She was most recently head of planning, regional and local at the ABC, and started out her career in community broadcasting. And she very famously has designed and introduced a system to track diversity media content at the ABC. So welcome all our panellists.
Thank you.
So I'm going to kick off with a question relating to that Media Diversity Australia report that was mentioned at the start. It found that despite 1 in 4 of Australia's 25 million people being born overseas, despite 46% having at least one parent who was born overseas and nearly 20% speaking a language other than English at home, that this report showed our newsrooms are still mainly white. It looked at a 2-week snapshot of newsrooms in June 2019, and it found more than 75% of presenters, commentators and reporters have an Anglo-Celtic background. Only 6% have an Indigenous or non-European background, and in the free-to-air television environment, all national news directors have an Anglo-Celtic background. So basically, they're all male. Following the report, some commentators have argued there's no problem with this, that the problem is that there needs to be more diversity of views, that newsrooms in Australia are actually quite left. So I'm wondering from our panellists, what's your response to that?
I'll go first if you like, Nasim. So firstly, we probably should acknowledge too that Mandy Wicks has been appointed as the new head of news for SBS. So at least we have one woman in there now in one of those national newsrooms. That was just earlier this week. So that was really good to see. Congratulations, Mandy. Look, I welcome the research from MDA and the universities, but I would have to say that there really is no surprise in this. You could have walked into any of the major newsrooms in Australia and then walked back out onto the street again, and you could see the difference. I mean, I think that the research confirms what any of us working in the industry know. But as far as the question goes, I think I would just reject the premise of the response from some of those organisations, which is to say that you can't have a debate about cultural diversity in the media, that the real debate is actually about left, right, centrist, political point of view. I do think that we can walk and chew gum. I think that you can have more than one discussion here. And I think that left, right, centrist argument is potentially a valid one and a debate worth having. And if people want to have that debate, by all means, have that debate, but go and have it over there. I mean, it's not a new debate. We've had it before. There's going to be more of it. And that's actually not what we're here to discuss today. I do think that based on the research alone, it is very valid that we talk about diversity and cultural diversity in the media. And so I completely reject the response by those players.
Tanya and Russell, what's your view?
Russell, do you?
Yeah, I think. Well, first of all, congratulations on the report. This is the first time that this has been done in Australia to such an extent that we get this detail. And it's quite shocking to know that overseas in UK and the US, this sort of thing is quite the norm, and should become the norm here. And it has to be done through universities rather than through the organisations themselves that could be leading the way in this. And I think it's really, really clear that if you have a diversity of people within the newsrooms, you'll get diversity of views and opinions based on their worldview, based on their upbringing, based on how they see the world. and I agree with Andrea that this is, nothing new in a way. But I think it's really good that we are now having this type of report and having this type of conversation that is a pivotal point at the moment, I think, that can create some change.
And look, I know we don't want to all be an agreeable panel here, but for me, the opinion is newsrooms to left. I don't think, I think if we stick to the point, and the fact is, as Andrea said, you go out onto the street and then you go into the newsroom, and the newsrooms and those behind the scenes making decisions are not diverse. And for me, as a Kuku Yamajan Berry woman, the impact of what I saw growing up, not only to me personally, but in my communities, was devastating. We are responsible as deliverers of news, as journalists, and to portray the facts and to, deliver the truth. And for me, we've always said, bad public perception leads to bad public policy. And we are in a position to inform that within newsrooms. And the fact is, we haven't been informing it correctly. And you can see that with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs in this country. And it is a matter of life and death. And, hats off to Media Diversity Australia for commissioning this report. And it's really important for us as media in this country to really reflect on this and how we improve and give audiences, Australian audiences, as you were saying when we opened up, our diverse Australian audience, the truth of what's going on in this country, but also reflecting the truth worldwide. So, just to not, it's a fact. The newsrooms are not diverse, left, right, whatever's going on in Canberra, we have to question it and question it factually. And there is unconscious bias that EPs can bring to it, whether they realise it or not. And, have a look at what we're doing, our structures, and we're in a really important position now. We're having this conversation, which is really exciting for, me, particularly within my position. We need to do more and, bring it on.
Do you guys think there's too much defensiveness in media about cultural diversity and race? And do you think there's actually sections of the media that try and stoke division and prejudice? And if so, how do we change that?
Look, I think there's definitely provocateurs, and I'm happy to bring on debate, but let's do it in all the facts. Make sure that it is objective, and we can back up all the information as well. So one thing, if you're trying to click or bring in attention to, we're very diverse, we're all fighting for that audience, but think about the impact that it could have, particularly if you're, basically being racist or, you don't have to go that far in the sense, we have to uphold who we are as newsrooms, as journalists. And, I think there is defensiveness going on. And, I think we need to really be accountable to that and make sure that we are holding ourselves up to account.
I agree. I think there is defensiveness, and I think the defensiveness is both on screen and on air, but it is also behind the scenes too. And we do see this in our newsrooms. And look, I understand the human reaction. Nobody wants to feel like they're the diversity high that they've got there through some sort of special privilege or having had a bit of a fast track in. Nobody wants to be known as the Indigenous intern or the diversity appointment in the newsroom. And surprise, surprise, Anglo people don't like it either when it gets pointed out to them. So I think that defensiveness is a human thing, and it will fade hopefully in time as people start to understand the reasons why we're pointing out these issues with diversity. So hopefully it'll pass and people will understand that they have got there through other people perhaps not having quite the same go as them. But their defensiveness is there, and you do get it when you do try to raise these issues within your workplaces. And people do want to sort of say they're doing things. We've got this policy in train, or we're working on that over here. And I appreciate it when people are making efforts, but the reality is that it hasn't translated into a fully representative diversity of the Australian community on air, and so there's still clearly work to be done. In terms of stoking prejudice in the public sphere, yeah, of course there are provocateurs, I agree, and you know, I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. I'm actually going to say that having them out there is important, and that's partly because I'd actually rather see where the prejudice is, where the hatred is being stoked, because then you can actually tackle it. You can hit it on the head. I'd rather actually go out there and have the argument and allow the audience to make up their minds about that. If you push it underground, I think we do run the risk of it becoming insidious and being very hard to deal with. So I welcome it. Bring it on. Bring on the biff, really.
And there's almost this air of, you know, are we being too politically correct by calling an article racist or calling a cartoon racist? You know, we've seen this, this happened with the Serena Williams cartoon by Mark Knight in 2018, and with the Kamala Harris cartoon in The Australian. It should be noted, though, that the Williams cartoon was found by the Press Council. They ruled that it's not, in fact, racist. They said it depicted Williams following her US Open loss it didn't depict her as an ape, it rather showed her spitting the dummy, and it was an exaggerated version. So this conversation often comes up about, are we being too politically correct? You know, can't we just have a joke? Do you think in these cases, these cartoons would have been published had the people at the top of the organisations been more diverse? And if yes or no, why?
Can I go back to the other questions and join into this one as well? I think we are. We do need. I'm an Anglo male, and I think we do need to be less defensive about what's happening and embrace multiculturalism. You know, there are many white Anglo males that are working in multicultural settings, living a life in multicultural families these days, and the real issue I think that's happening is that white Anglo males in the media are stoking this type of division. I think they're becoming a minority. I think they're not only, and they're getting defensive around that issue, and they're becoming a minority not only through migration, but through a whole mix within the community of white Anglo males. You know, white Anglo male community becoming less white Anglo, if such a thing as a community of white Anglo males. But, you know, that, and I think that's where this division is coming in. I think there's a real defensiveness around that, and how we could possibly change that, and going back to that question, how we could change that is through, of course, stopping that divisive type of reporting is through ACMA, through the Communications Media Association, or let the organisations themselves make those changes. And I think that's a slow pace. It doesn't happen quickly. I think what we're seeing lately is a real groundswell, combined with corporate sort of ethics and morals around this sort of responsibility. Certainly the Alan Jones case, where he told our Prime Minister that Jacinda Ardern should be have a few backhands and a sock stuffed down her throat, saw an outrage of complaints and advocacy groups campaigning about that. And this led to a whole withdrawal of 50% of the revenue from 2GB from advertisers. And for the first time, the management at 2GB called out Alan Jones on it. So I think where the change can really come from is really relying on the changes that are recurring. We're seeing with Black Lives Matters, a groundswell, a change in migration, a change of society fundamentally that's forcing these sorts of issues. And so I'm just jumping back to that question because I thought it was a really important one as a white Anglo male to jump in there and say, I think the overall sort of picture of what's happening in that area. And just briefly on the issue around the cartoons, I think there's how many thousands of cartoons produced every year that don't, you know, create this sort of division and controversy. And it's really coming from a minority of people that do cartoons, and where they do those cartoons, where are they coming from? They're coming again from a minority of people, and coming from either the Sun Herald or the Australian, which is, you know, Murdoch owned. So I think you've got again this issue where they're becoming a minority, and society's changing, and there's more pressure being applied on what they do and how they present themselves in this multicultural society that we're in.
I love it that you can, you know, many more white Anglo males be having your perspective, particularly those in positions to employ and grow and transform their newsrooms around the country. So to answer that question as well, you know, completely agree in the sense, I run or oversee pretty much an all Indigenous news and current affairs team within NITV. And would they have done that comic strip? No. In Corey Mail does comic strips. Would they have done it? No. The perspective is really important. And, you know, but if I could imagine when I was that, you know, lonely old only Indigenous journalist in the newsroom at ABC many moons ago, how I could deal with the all non-Indigenous producing teams making those decisions as well. So I think you can't underestimate that, that, you know, for those that you do have those cadets or, you know, Indigenous or, you know, non-Indigenous, if you have your Indigenous journalists, if they're the only one in that newsroom, how hard that could be. So really, you know, if there was diversity around the decision table, most definitely not. And would we have shied away from being, you know, provoking as the way the cartoon wanted to provoke? No, it would be very clever, but it's where the perspective is at, and you wouldn't have drawn from the otherising lens that a lot of Anglo-Saxon males would put on, particularly people of colour and particularly Indigenous people.
Yeah, it is. To me, it is a really interesting and complex question. And, you know, both of you have raised, I think, good ways of looking at it. For me, I love political cartooning. I love stuff that skewers, you know, different thoughts and groupthink, and makes you look at different ways of looking at stuff. So, look, I can't speak for what was in Mark Knight's mind. I don't know what was in Leak's head, or their editors, their subs for that matter. I can't say. But if I look at what cartooning is, it's not a 600-word article, right? It's a very small depiction. It's usually like a single illustration with maybe a handful of words, and it therefore, I think, relies on a lot of assumptions, cultural tropes, if you like, in order for it to be successful. That's the whole point. You know, it takes those, turns them on their head, skewers, and does whatever it does. So for me, the issue of diversity comes in here around what the cultural tropes are that we use and that are perpetuated and understood around this. So if your cultural tropes are based on old, outdated, racist assumptions, and you don't realise they are because that's just what you have assimilated in your everyday thoughts and views that have come up through, you know, your history education at school, or, you know, whatever, wherever you got your thinking from. And perpetuating those is a problem because you are perpetuating racism unthinkingly. And so that's, I guess, a generous point of view. Now, if you use those tropes deliberately in order to cause division, then I think that that's a problem. And perhaps different leadership would root that out at the top, but you don't always know. I mean, really, when it comes down to it, though, and I've written on this, that if you're going to make a joke based on something that a person hasn't done, but that they can't help, so their appearance, their background, their country of birth, their accent, their voice, whatever, then it's a really poor joke, and it's not a good joke. You know, really play the issue, don't play the man.
I don't know if any of you agree, but, you know, I look back on 80s TV in Australia or the likes, what influenced a lot of us, and you listen to those jokes now and you watch that and it's jarring, or even when you watch the way old footy shows used to be and the likes as well. So you got to think our evolution as media professionals in this country, what we're going to be looking back on in the way we're portraying our country today, I think is really important discussion we have. But do you know what I mean? Like when you look back on some of those old jokes that everyone used to laugh about, and you just think, what were we thinking?
Yeah, we're not in Kingswood country anymore, are we? Hey.
Yeah, I saw that going around in social the other day. Yeah, exactly. But I agree. Look, I understand in rooms you're trying to attract the audience, as I said, but if you're on purposely trying to make that division, which is what I think we need to really question ourselves on, that's something else. And as Russell was saying, there's accountabilities in place. We have to put ourselves at high regard in that sense, because we can be better than this.
The report also found that 77% of respondents with culturally diverse backgrounds believe their backgrounds are actually a barrier to career progression. Many of the free-to-air TV bosses have argued, well, culturally diverse people just aren't applying for these jobs. But if that's the case, what actually are the barriers to entry, and how do we get you know, to work to get that pipeline of diverse talent. And I know, Russell, you're particularly passionate about this subject.
Yeah, so the NMBC has been working on this for 5 years now with different groups and held conferences, and we're working on this pipeline of diverse talent from our community radio sector for years. So we have 4,000 volunteers that do ethnic community broadcasting that produce 2,000 hours a week of programs. I mean, it's incredible. Some universities are working with multicultural organisations and students to try to get them into the mainstream media, let me call it that way. So we have this pool of talent. It's out there, but there's lots of barriers. I mean, even research shows that, you know, by changing your name and making it more Anglo, you get a better chance of getting an interview. So that's just the first barriers to get to. And media has its own special barriers as well. You know, what does the media outlet want to play on their television screen? Who do they want to show on a radio program? What sort of accent do they want? And they're aiming for still the mainstream sort of accent, the mainstream look, unfortunately. So the media is also not a very inviting place at all to work. It is very fast paced. It's very hard. We have to be honest, you know, to look at is our pool of people up to scratch to get into that as well. And that's what we're looking at, a whole range of stepping stones, and our community media training organisation is setting up a journalist course at the moment. And it's basically the first stepping stone to come from community broadcasting into university or into the mainstream. So we're aiming that way. Definitely, and it's a big change though, and I don't think it's something that's going to happen quickly. It's happening slowly, but I think the real change has to come from the fact that the institutions need to change themselves. They need to start looking at themselves and saying, okay, well, we're not going to get people while we have these simple barriers, but when people go into the institution itself, how long are they going to last for? You know, there's unconscious bias, there's direct racism against people that go into these mainstream institutions, and they don't last that long. They end up resigning or having to move on. So it needs a big institutional change. And maybe in a way, when you start thinking, once you get more diverse people going in to do the newsrooms, you get different reporting, maybe you start to get a different structure as well within the media institutions. It's more open to how you do the media, how you report on the media, slow down the media, talk to people more, don't rush things, you know, be more conversational, create a better narrative. So I think there's a massive amounts of change that need to happen. But there is a pipeline and there is possibility. It is happening.
Definitely. So we like to call it decolonising the structures. You know, I think we've, you know, acknowledged the fact that systemic change is really required across all of our, you know, across the media industry in general, if we're going to really see, you know, getting more Indigenous or, you know, you know, people of colour into the rooms. And, you know, I was a journalist and I didn't stay, you know, and there's so many of us that have that story, the retention. Yeah, it's great having the cadetships and those programs, but, you know, what does stop and prevent people from growing and, you know, going up the ladder and breaking the ceilings? It's been, you know, it's bloody tough. It's a very different industry from when I started out. I get that, but I think the reports like this is, you know, you hear what people are saying, there is still, you know, the structure is preventing the growth. And we've got to take a good look within and then, you know, make those changes. And there are people telling us, and the answers are right in front of us. So that's the exciting opportunity that we do have.
I want to say that this question, excuse me, makes me really angry. And it's not you, Nasim, because I know that you're quoting the people who've said this. It makes me really angry because it actually puts the onus back on the people applying. You know, why aren't we turning up? Why aren't we fronting up? And the implication there is if we just fronted up, we'd get jobs. And then if we front up and get jobs, that will be progressed and, you know, everything would be fine. And I think both Russell and Tanya have pointed out that there are actually systemic issues and as to why we don't either get in the first place, or when we get there, why we don't survive, let alone thrive. And I think that that's actually a really big issue that media organisations have to look at themselves. They have to look at what stall they're setting out for the people who they want to apply into the organisation. And, you know, this report points out that the stall that people see who might want to work in the media is that there aren't very many people who are like themselves in those newsrooms. And when they start to look at the more senior ranks, that the people who look like them either get there and stay there for 5 minutes and then, as both Russell and Tanya have said, moved on, or feel as though they need to move on because they, you know, it's just a little bit too much, or they don't see themselves there at all. And I would say that for every one of those people who is no longer there or hasn't quite made it to the top, every manager has a reason for that about that person, and it's fine. I mean, you can look at that person and say, yeah, look, they weren't quite right. They weren't as good as the other person who we've appointed, or whatever. You can look at each individual, and the reasoning is there, and the reasoning is sound. What you can't ignore, though, is the fact that if you look across the industry, that's a micro look. If you zoom out and you take a macro look at the situation, how is it that nobody is good enough? How is it that nobody of colour, that nobody of Indigenous background is good enough to hold any of these positions? That's when I think it becomes clear that what we're talking about here is not individuals, but a trend. And what we're seeing here is a systematic issue, of which the trend is indicative. And so look, to take an example, which is a very recent one in all of our minds, Stan Grant, an eminent and experienced journalist and reporter and host and academic and author, was the first Indigenous presenter of Four Corners, and he presented the first Four Corners episode by an Indigenous person a matter of weeks ago. And the day before that went to air, he was on Insiders. He was only the second Indigenous commentator panellist to be on Insiders after Bridget Brennan, the awesome Bridget. Now, how is it that these two people are not good enough to have ever been featured before, to have only ever made it there after the Black Lives Matter explosion occurred in media around the world? I would ask, if they're not good enough, what does anybody of colour have to do to be good enough to actually make it there? The problem is not the pipeline. The problem is not the people of colour applying or not applying. The problem is the stall that's being set out by mainstream media and the barriers that are inherent in those organisations. That's where the change needs to happen.
I mean, the report did also find that 77% of respondents with culturally diverse backgrounds, as I mentioned before, couldn't progress. But then there's also the audience that we have about. So do we actually turn audiences off if all they see when they turn on the television is Anglo-Saxon people presenting the media and speaking in the media?
I think so. If you're talking about the audience I'm a part of, the community that I'm a part of, for sure, most definitely. And I think, you know, the otherising of First Nations people that has been going on in this country since colonisation is, you know, that's how newsrooms and media outlets have evolved as well with that, you know, from the ethnographic sort of telling of our stories as well. So when we're not placed, we're not included in your narratives in Australia, of course, you know, where do we see ourselves? And, you know, obviously this is the reason NITV, you know, evolved back in 2006, 2007. But our story began long before that. It was decades to try and have a place where we could see ourselves in the Australian media landscape. And it wasn't until the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody outlined the importance for all Australians, in fact, to see us reflected in a truthful manner, but to go to a point about what Andrea made not too long ago about the power of seeing what you can potentially be, whether that's on screen, but also within, you know, the executive table or in, you know, behind the scenes as well, is enormous. And also the power of seeing yourself represented positively. My particular community, you know, with just 3% of Australia's population, you know, possibly 6 out of 10 Australians haven't met us or care to meet us. So their information of us is from, you know, that box or that paper or that radio. So, you know, I think it's a really important, you know, point that, you know, in having this discussion as well for us in this particular way.
I reckon that there are sections of the audience who'll be fine with that, with seeing only Anglo faces, and it's actually kind of understandable. You know, if you're in an if you're an Anglo person yourself and you're in an only Anglo family, and that's who's in your friendship group and that's who you work with and so on, you probably actually don't see the absence of all of the other kinds of faces which are on the media. So that's actually understandable, and that was. Australia looked a little bit more like that maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago. We've become much more diverse over the intervening decades, you know. What I think it's undeniable here, though, is that that audience is actually shrinking. You know, as Russell said, you know, he works amongst Anglo people who are in multicultural communities. As Tanya said, you know, Indigenous communities in Australia are thriving, and they want to see themselves portrayed in the wholeness of who they are, and not just as objects in news media. So I think that there'll still be an audience for media that is Anglo heavy, but that audience is shrinking. And for all of us who are working in a challenged environment, where are you going to put your eggs? Are you going to put your eggs in the basket of the shrinking prospects, or are you actually going to be looking for and chasing the broader audiences? And I think that that's a question that that news executives and that media managers really have to be asking themselves now, because if they don't answer those questions for themselves, the audiences will make the choice for them.
Yeah, I think that's a big issue. I think that for the stations themselves, if they want to maintain an audience, they really, with 25% of the Australian society speaks a language other than English at home. I mean, so, you know, those just speaking a language of English at home, let alone the cultures that resonate out from that, the connections that people have with all those people. So that's the audience that mainstream media needs to start shifting to capture that audience.
And it's remiss of me not to give a call out to my colleagues across SBS. You know, one of the most regularly highly watched programs across our slate of content on SBS is World News and Insight and also Dateline, but particularly World News, and how diverse are our reporters, as are highlighted in the MDA report as well. So I think, you know, as you're saying, Andrea, if the audience who want to just see you know, I'd like to think our audiences do want to see more of the truth of their Australia as well, and that audience is shrinking, and we do have the facts to show that as well, that, you know, diversity sells, Indigenous content sells. It's, you know, commercialised. Our biggest content in Australia at the moment in dramas, Indigenous stories, our news stories. You know, that's, you know, if it comes down to your bottom line in that sense, these stories sell.
And actually on that, you know, you're exactly right, Tanya. In that sense, it's about what sells. And if the advertisers, the most hard-headed group of people you have ever seen, as we all know, are actually starting to include coloured faces in their ads now, then I think that tells you something about this. It's not actually just a nice to have thing anymore to have different kinds of faces on the telly or you know, in your broadcast. It's actually necessary now. Otherwise, people just won't choose you anymore.
There's actually currently no legislated requirement for organisations or employers to collect and report on cultural diversity in their workforce, although the ABC have started collecting and reporting this data, and SBS have also said they will do so soon. Do you think that collection of such data actually needs to be mandated? Now, we've had this conversation quite broadly in corporate Australia as to whether, you know, quotas on women on boards needs to be mandated. So do we need to now take that a step further and talk about, you know, having more culturally diverse people high at the top of organisations?
Look, I've spent a long time thinking about this, and particularly when I was at the ABC. Something too I do want to note that the ABC hasn't just started collecting and reporting this data. They've been doing it for a very, very, very long time, and those reports are actually publicly available. You can go and have a look at the ABC's annual equity and diversity reports online anytime. They've got plenty of data about the workforce in those. So this isn't something new or different, and that I think is really important, because the question here is not, I don't think, about collecting data. It's actually what you do with it. Collecting data is not an end in itself. It's a tool. It's a function. And so you can be collecting this data ad nauseum for years and years and years. It's not actually a precursor or a predictor of change in any way. However, the data is useful if you want to figure out where you need to make effort to be able to see where you are now, measure that against where you'd like to be, and to be able to see the difference between the two and to put your interventions in that place. So that's the purpose of data. So mandating the collection of data is pointless if there isn't a mandated use of that data to force change, if that makes sense. On this, for this, I think in the culturally diverse space to actually be effective, it wouldn't be a bad idea for the Australian Bureau of Statistics or for the federal government to actually have a bit of a look at an updated version of how we measure cultural and linguistic diversity. I mean, really, the ABS only puts out information to do with NESB, non-English speaking background, which in my view is a really outdated, archaic way of measuring cultural diversity in Australia. And the ABS can actually make these kinds of changes. They're looking at the moment at how they might collect some data, better data, about the LGBTQI+ community in Australia, because it's really important for us in terms of social planning public services and so on. The same is, I think, true as well of cultural diversity. And while the ABS does count a lot of data that relates to cultural diversity, you know, country of origin or language spoken at home, whatever, they don't wrap it up effectively in a measure which we might call core cultural and linguistic diversity. If they were to do that, then they would be able to provide a really nice understanding of the Australian population that then media organisations could measure themselves against and say, how are we going compared to our population? And then we would have a common language, a common way of talking about this problem, and a common way of seeking solutions. So I think that this is a really interesting area in which we could do a whole heap of better work, but the work doesn't end with collecting data. The work only starts there.
Look, I agree with all that you're saying. We need to measure, we do. It just can't be holistic. You know, if we don't measure, you don't have organisational shift to target directly to get there. So you can't do it in isolation. And I guess it's important to call out, you know, sometimes people don't want to identify in a way because of how we've, you know, been treated. And, you know, how we create the safety within organisations or within these data collection systems as well is really important. So exactly what you're saying, do it within a holistic manner. But I do believe we do have to have the target set because if you don't set it, this is my opinion, you just don't go there to get there. But you need to do it in the right way, and it's a two-way street as well. There's still a lot of trauma in dealing with what identifying actually does to you.
And I think mandating media organisations to do something is always problematic as well. As much as I'd like to see a lot more mandating of media organisations, that puts much more faith in what government would do with it. But certainly mandating organisations, media organisations, to do something is extremely difficult. And I think it's better if they were to actually take it on and do it themselves and have that ownership where they would then use that to produce something as an outcome. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, well, I think it's time now to move to, we have about 15 minutes or so left for all the audience questions. So I'm going to try my best to ask as many as I can of them. I just can't see the questions. I see very sorry if anyone saw offensive comments and read the questions in the answered tabs.
There we are. If you press answered, I think there we are.
Where is the answered?
At the top.
Oh, apologies, guys. It's got all panelists and attendees at the top. Ah, here we go. All right. So the one at the top says there's been barriers as to why the survey overlooked NITV in its count. Yes, this has been big. It's been clarified that the decision had been deliberate. I can see why NITV is not mainstream as the survey set out to study. Happy to hear from the panelists on that view. Additionally, how can those who are with the diverse cause help enhance the value of the survey?
Look, I spoke to Tanya, Antoinette about this. I think it would have been great to have had us put up a measure of where you could get to, the potential and the influence of the fact that, we did not start NITV and boom, it was there. It has been a consistent, strategic and hard-fought focus process, actually, and attracting the journalists, growing the journalists. We were initially a 5-minute rip and read service. We've got a lot of pressure on us as an Indigenous channel. Do we invest more money into commissioning? Do we invest more money into sports and the like? So we're constantly making those decisions. We made it quite clear we needed to invest in growing a diverse news and current affairs service. And, I spoke to Tony, obviously, that's policy direction the federal government gave into SBS to ensure that an Indigenous channel would be delivered. And we've not only, survived as an Indigenous channel, but we are thriving. And I think as well as pointing out the great work of the likes of ABC within the document, just having a great sort of way that we could actually show that in Australia, we've got a very successful Indigenous news and current affairs service, and we tell the stories of Australia as much as we tell the stories of Indigenous people. So, for me, I would have loved to have had our journalists recognised in that sense. Outside of the surveying approach, I do believe we need to really look at all our newsrooms in the mainstream sense, or the sense of who are the commercial players across ABC and SBS as well. It would have been great just to have had that recognition of what we've achieved with our little dip in the ocean of public broadcasting funds and how we've delivered to that.
I think it's interesting and reassuring to know that you've had that conversation with the MDA crew, Tanya. Thank you. It's good for me to kind of hear that and internalise that. I think to the second part of the question, what can be done to enhance the value of the survey. And I think it is actually that. It's the corollary. The survey points out the problem, but I think now it's the time to look at the solution, the possible solutions. There are obviously more than one. And one of the ways in which you might do that are to look at places where success is occurring. And so NITV's news service is definitely a place that we could be looking at and sort of saying, what can we learn from what you're doing and how can that be applied more broadly?
I think there's a really good question here about, what's the next action that MDA or us as individuals can take. We have panel discussion. Yeah, we can have panel discussions all day long, but I suspect viewers are similarly minded as the panel and it doesn't make substantial progress. I really agree with the kind of premise of that question. We all sit here and we talk about diversity, but when we actually go back out to the newsroom, it doesn't really translate. So what do you think are some strategies to get more people on board?
Yeah, I can speak to that a bit. I totally agree with that. Having discussions are really good. I think it's really great to be part of this, which is not a full discussion. I'd like everybody to be involved in the discussion. But I think it is true. Actions all need to be taken, and certainly the NNBC is doing a lot in that regard and working with MDA as well. Presently, we recognise that it's not only a position where people represented in the media or in the management of media is an issue, but also who the journalists speak to is a problem as well, is that they tend to go to the same sort of people and they don't get to people from diverse backgrounds. And so we're trying to create linkages and connections with people in Victoria that come from culturally, linguistically diverse backgrounds to be able to connect and speak to the media more often. So a directory, in a sense, and asking people to put their names down to be able to be contacted by media, so that there's just better coverage of different views in in the media. That's just one of the areas we're working on, and it's a constant update from us of what we're doing as an organisation.
I wrote an entire paper on this, Nasim. I had a Churchill scholarship which I undertook in 2016, and looking at increasing cultural diversity in broadcast media. And there are 10 recommendations in that. First amongst those, I think, is for executive leadership to understand the problem and to champion in solutions to that problem, and for those to be real solutions, not just fluffy solutions or optics, nice optics, but actually making genuine and real change. And those changes have to happen within the people in the organisations, within the content within the organisations, and within the executive ranks themselves. So that's just a couple out of the 10 recommendations in that report that I just pulled out of the top of my head. For all of us who are on the bandwagon though, which I think is what Darren was asking, what can we all do? I think that does vary depending on the organisation that you're with, but go and have a good hard look and just figure out what it is that you can do. And that might be, as Russell says, you choose some different talent to put into your stories, or depending on where you sit in the organisation, it might be that you actually start to count who appears in your content. If you're a hiring manager, make sure that you interview some people of culturally diverse background, Indigenous background, and hire some as well. There are lots of different ways in which this problem can be tackled. There is no one single solution, but there are plenty of things that all of us can do.
And yeah, no, I agree. And connect with the community, go outside your usual networks, as Russell was saying. I think, take that step. And look, for me, this is the first time I've ever participated in a discussion like this. And I think can't underestimate the moment we're in this time off the back of Black Lives Matter. And, people can, whether it's, it should have been done before this, but I think we're in the midst of the biggest civil rights movement of our era, of our generation, and it starts with this sort of discussion and these steps, and yet change now needs to happen. So go out, connect with your local community, whoever that community is going to be.
There's a question here about whether you include inclusion and diversity as a module or topic at university or in a comms course. And does this mean it becomes part of the debate and discussion early on rather than being forced on everyone in the workplace?
I have a kind of funny feeling about calling it out and doing it as a separate module, if that's the only way in which it's addressed. I actually think that this is a conversation that needs to be woven through every part of education in terms of media, just as it should be woven through every aspect of work in a media organisation. If you call it out and you sit it off to one side, then it tends to become a bit of a special subject. You put some special people on it, probably usually people of culturally diverse background who then don't get to do general reportage. There's no advantage, I don't think, necessarily in calling it out as its own special thing, unless it's a highlight of something which is woven right through the education system.
Yeah, I think that people in universities are getting more aware of this, and they're within the communications courses that they're holding, they're recognising that they need to be discussing more about diversity, what's happening. I mean, Australia is has an incredibly diverse media sector, really. I think the report correctly focused on mainstream television media and what's happening in that area, because it's so weighted towards Anglo-Saxon white males, and I think that's deserved. But if you look at the diversity within the media in Australia, just address those issues and show what's happening in those areas. We get people, we're part of different universities' courses where they bring university students to us and we talk about our sector and explain to them how diverse it is. And some of those people end up in our community broadcasting sector because they can't get jobs in the mainstream media, so it's a stepping stone up for them. And I think just being more broad in what you do as a communications course and showing what's happening in Australia would be helpful in that diversity. And
beyond uni as well, obviously, from primary school, kindergarten, childcare, woven in all aspects. This is as I mentioned earlier, decolonising all these systems, the structures that the colonisers created, and that were the foundation blocks that we're now a part of, and how we've got to shift that. I think unis, particularly, I remember when I was at uni, were actually a lot more forthright within this is 20 years ago. I went to uni in Rockhampton, But once I got through that door into ABC Newsroom, it was a different story. So I think definitely we have shifted a lot in education. We need to do a lot more. It needs to be completely from the very beginning of our education system. But the focus really does need to be within our news outlets.
So I think we've got time for one or two more. What impact do the presenters think that changing media landscape will have on diversity, thinking especially of people who are able to start their own digital and social media channels?
So I can be really cynical here, and I can say that that this is what happens when you've got mainstream media who don't serve those audiences. The audiences will make their own media. Yep, exactly right. They have their own ways now of being able to distribute to get it to the audience, and that's what happens. Is if you don't serve a community, it happens in business. Then another business pops up and does their own thing. So you will see the increasing fragmentation of the media landscape, and you will see people going voting with their feet effectively. And look, if you're not seeing it already with NITV and with First Nations media, you should be. I have not seen a more vibrant media sector in Australia for a very long time. And why not? Indigenous people are making their own media in newsrooms and production houses where you are in the majority, where you are able to tell full stories about your community, not just about issues, not just about yourselves as victims, but as whole and healthy communities doing your own thing. Why would you need to buy into the mainstream media? If I was Indigenous, I would totally just be looking at the First Nations media offering all around Australia. And I think that it's a harbinger for other kinds of media fragmentation, which is great for those communities. And I think it's really fantastic and healthy. But if we are thinking about social cohesion in Australia and we want everybody to be a part of the success of Australia and for us not to all do our own separate thing, but to work together, then it's a problem. So I think that that's where mainstream media are at a pivotal point where we can actually choose to include everybody and to continue to pull together and to create a One Australia where we all have a diversity of voices and we all have a place. Or they can cling to their old bastion kind of ideas and voices and let the opportunity slip away. The choice is yours.
I couldn't agree with you more in the sense, as I started this, bad public perception leads to bad public policy. For us, it is a matter of life and death, literally. So, that influence and that change of reflecting the truth, but, showing us in all our truths as well. And no, I'm really excited about this, disruptive era. But as Andrea mentioned, we've been doing it within our communities, back in the day at Yondamu, Pirate TV, and switching off because we weren't getting what we needed to. So it's great. We have a thriving storytelling sector within community broadcasting. And there's talent there. The talent is there. The talent is there is all I can say. And the stories in this beautiful country of ours and how we can shift the conversation is so important. And, the bus has left the station, so to speak. And I think, as you can see, we've got, Brooke Boney there on today. And we've got a lot of people that started at NITV all over commercial media. And we want to see more of them as well. And, we're just at the beginning. It's so exciting.
And I think, Tanya, as well, I think maybe it's the same with what's happening for ethnic community broadcasting. The audiences are not shifting. They're actually staying listening to radio. The real issues that television face is the drop of audience, and the same with newspapers with their audience. But with radio, it's being maintained. There might come a tipping point when radio starts to get into more trouble when digital platforms, podcasts start to become more prevalent. But really the audiences in diverse communities are still listening to those audiences, and probably Indigenous listen to your station because that's where they get their source of local information. And what we're finding is there's an add-on. So in ethnic community broadcasting, there used to be, it's a local broadcast, so you broadcast to your community. But now they have a digital platform, so they use Facebook and Stream. And so now our ethnic broadcasters are broadcasting to back home, and they're also broadcasting to a diaspora. So some people get thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of hits on their Facebook from their local community, but from their home and diaspora. So the digital space is creating a lot wider audience for a local broadcaster. So that changing landscape is creating more diversity and opportunities as well.
Yeah, totally, just so I know I already had a comment, but as Andrew mentioned, the inclusion or social cohesion is paramount. Seeing yourself included is, you know, we pay mortgages, we're a part of society in Australia. We deserve to see ourselves, whatever the medium.
And I think that the implications, if you don't, are dire as well. I mean, if you don't see yourself represented in the community, why should you vote? Why should you participate in any kind of civil activity? Why should you contribute? And I think that that we're seeing the results of exactly that kind of exclusion in other English-speaking countries around the world, where minorities have been pushed down and where they haven't been included in public life. So, again, I think that we're not that far down that track here in Australia that it's irrecoverable. I think we can certainly pull it back, but there is the incentive for media organisations to diversify. It's actually to not only hold audience, but to keep a cohesive Australia. And I think that that's really very important. It's a great incentive.
Well, I think we'll end on that note because we've run out of time. Thank you all to our fabulous panellists today. It's been wonderful to get your ideas, and hopefully these conversations can keep rolling on in newsrooms. And thank you to everyone who took their lunch break today to listen to us. And we hope you can all go back and have these conversations as well. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Nasim.
Thank you, Nasim.
Thanks, Russell and
Thanks,
Tanya.
everybody. Thanks a lot.